at the end. So East and West Midlands. So our outlook this year was looking at the government's mission to raise living standards across the country. We looked at that from the perspective of urban Britain. As you can see here, our cities make up a minority of the land area of the country, but contains about, or more than half of the population and about 2/3 of the national economy. So any strategy to raise living standards across the country cannot do that without thinking about our urban areas. So let's first talk about sort of where we are in terms of living standards. Now we're measuring that by disposable income per person. That is, in cash terms, what people have to spend on their material standard of living after their incomes and things like taxes and transfers. This shows you, the range across the country. You've got sort of ranging up from London at the top there, all the way down to Blackburn at the bottom. So significant variation across the country. You see cities highlighted in green. Those are in the Greater South East. They have disposable incomes about 40% higher than the rest of the country. What I've done there as well is I've highlighted Midland cities, and many of them are concentrated towards the bottom there. You've got Northampton sticking out more towards the top there. And as you can see as I go through the slides, that's a bit of a theme as we go through. But this variation, it might seem familiar, and that's because it is. And, we're basically in the same place as we were on the eve of the financial crisis. That is, same variation, same rough levels, and same regional divides. And as you can see, including cities in the Midlands, that actually, in real terms, after accounting for inflation, disposable incomes have really not moved at all. In fact, in most places, they've stagnated slightly. Why do we care about disposable incomes? Well, it's a good measure of living standards, and what broadly we can see is that lower disposable incomes mean higher shares of local concentrations of deprivation. What this shows here is disposable incomes against the share of neighbourhoods in the top fifth most deprived in the country in 2025 from the latest index for multiple deprivation. As you can see there, that is no different in the Midlands. You see cities up there, particularly Birmingham at the top there, but also places like Derby, Stoke, Leicester, Coventry all have relatively high shares of local deprivation. That's directly related to their low average levels of disposable income, which is important to say because, for most places, if you want those income rises to be felt by everyone, then you have to raise average incomes. There's simply not enough of the economic pie to go around. So sort of focusing on those economic principles is a good place to start. Well, it's worth sort of just discussing briefly how we got to this stage and, making explicit the tie between economic growth and incomes growth. So what I'll take you through is I'll whiz you through the past sort of, 30, well, yeah, almost 30 years or so, where you see before the financial crisis, everywhere was growing in terms of their economy and also was experiencing rising disposable incomes. I've highlighted Derby there as just, one of these places that was experiencing that. Now that all came to a halt after the financial crisis and the kind of the aftermath of it, the 5 years following, and Derby was no different there. And what this shows is that without economic growth, you see growth stagnating in some places, even declining in others. You do not see rising disposable incomes. In fact, they fell pretty much everywhere over that period. Now, since the financial crisis, there's been a recovery, albeit a slow one. What you see is that that relationship between economic growth and disposable income has flattened out slightly. So there's been a kind of disconnect between places that recovered some economic growth but not seen the requisite recovery in living standards. Derby has actually seen neither, but more broadly, some of that is because you're not seeing the levels of growth that you were before the financial crisis, but there's something else going on there, and I think that's what our report tries to dig into. So let's zoom in on those green dots there. What we've done is we've just divided them up into places, that have done better or worse than the national average in terms of economic growth and disposable income growth. Now, what you see there in the top left, places like Derby and Mansfield, actually uh, they've seen incomes growth despite their local economies, not because of that. Now that's due to a few factors, particularly where that income is coming from. These places have lots of people, slightly older populations, lots of people with pension incomes, etc. At the bottom right there, you've seen places that have actually seen decent economic growth, but maybe that's not gone to their residents, and that's because people come in from outside and enjoy the proceeds. But what we focus on in this report are places what we call achieving greater prosperity. That is places that manage to reconnect economic growth to disposable income growth and outperformed the UK over this period, where actually on average, there's been relative stagnation. Now, I've not labelled them there, but these are places like Barnsley, Brighton, Worthing. So, actually, lots of places all across the country from different starting points, which means that there is a lesson there for everywhere, no matter the starting point, no matter your performance up to this point. And I think it's worth focusing that there aren't actually any Midlands cities in that group. I mean, the closest we come there is Telford, which just falls behind the national average of disposable income growth. But yeah, Midlands cities concentrated more towards the left or the bottom of that chart there. So, well, within all of this, it's trying to understand the ingredients for achieving greater prosperity to raise living standards across the country. What do our successful cities have, and what are the places that have bounced back? What are they doing? It starts with from our productive business base. So we focus on this as the kind of production side of the economy, the core of where living standards are generated and what places can do to create that. And then that can get shared around its residents. So this nice lollipop chart shows a few indicators of economic performance relative to the UK average and grouping cities by their disposable income levels. What it shows is we focus on these jobs called KIBS, knowledge intensive business services. These are mainly office based. These are high skilled. They are, they make up the backbone of the UK's industrial strategy. We know the UK has a competitive advantage in them on the global market. So these are the things you should be focusing on if you want to kind of kickstart economic growth in your area. What this shows is that places with higher share of KIBs, they've got higher productivity jobs, so the city is more productive. That means that firms can pay higher wages to workers there. That puts money in their pockets. They go out and spend to raise their standards of living, but also in the local economy to support people working in local services, and then it filters through there. And this is what that shows. Places with lower disposable incomes underperform on these measures. Places with higher ones outperform. And unfortunately for the Midlands, most of its cities fall in that sort of bottom group there. Northampton is the one that stands out. I'd say within that, there's a bit of variation. Places like Telford and Derby actually tend to do relatively well on things like workplace wages and KIBS share, but it doesn't quite feed through into disposable incomes. So that's the kind of basis for everywhere, particularly places with underperforming economies. You've got to sort of start that economic growth, focus on your business base. You've got to generate the proceeds in order for living standards to rise. But it's not the whole story. And actually, you need residents to access those proceeds to get the living standards, from where the production side of the economy to, where they live. And the most direct way you can do that is simply, are they working in the local economy? Can they get a job? What this shows here: higher disposable incomes per person in the local area. These places have higher employment rates. More people can access those proceeds. That comes from, do they have the requisite skills to get jobs in their local economy? That is both on the high skilled side, can they work in those cutting edge industries, but also simply, do you have any qualifications whatsoever? And that lets you get a good job and sort of bring income into the household. There's a bit of a mix of performance in the Midlands here. You've got places like Leicester, Birmingham, Coventry, where actually, part of that issue is that employment rates are relatively low. There are lots of people not accessing the proceeds that the local economy generates. Meanwhile, places like Telford and Northampton do a bit better. And then finally, there's making sure that, whatever prosperity you generate and share it around with the residents, that there aren't kind of constraints stopping that further growing and further sharing those proceeds more widely in your local economy. I think the most emblematic one there is housing. You'd expect places with higher incomes, more successful economies to spend more, a higher share of their spending on housing, but you don't want that to rise to unmanageable levels. For instance, up at the top there, some of those green dots, places like London, Cambridge, where people spending about 18% of their disposable income on housing. And actually, if you think about that as an average, a lot of people will be paying a lot more there. I think one thing to say with Midlands cities is that there doesn't seem to be such a binding constraint there, at least not on the housing side. So you've got places like Northampton, which actually have relatively high disposable incomes, actually similar to places like Cambridge, except residents are paying a lot less towards housing just because Northampton, it's got that kind of new town DNA. It's been growing, it has a permissive approach to development. You see places in the northwest like Warrington doing the same. Um, but similarly with places with low disposable incomes, there's not such a demand on housing, so housing costs are going to be relatively small. But there are other aspects of constraints. You've got to make sure for your economy to grow that there's got to be enough commercial space for firms to set up shop and add themselves to the productive capacity of the economy. Uh, but we're just looking at housing here. So that those are kind of broadly our three ingredients. It's having that productive business base, it's making sure people can access it, and the places aren't restricting further access through, their built form and infrastructure and housing. We wanted to sort of do a bit of an exercise and say, okay, what if places had bounced back like that top performing group? Like, what if places had managed to continue growing above national economic growth and crucially tied that to rising living standards? As you can see, the cumulatively across the decade, after accounting for inflation, there'd be thousands more per person in local people's pockets, and that's no different in the Midlands. You see, actually, Northampton, which has done relatively well in terms of the economy, has maybe not tied that quite to rising living standards. If it had, it would see about £6,500 more per person in people's pockets. Places like Stoke, Nottingham, Coventry, also around 5,000 mark, and then a few places, Leicester, Telford, which actually perform relatively well compared to other places, a lower sum. But this kind of just illustrates that getting these ingredients right can make material differences to living standards in local economies, but also for the national economy. So it goes back to, assessing the government objective and first off where living standards come from. And it's just making explicit that point that even at the local level, even in Midland cities, that rising living standards ultimately come from local economic growth. And so there should be a few things to focus on, national lessons, learning from successful cities, but also local places. It's about focusing on business base. We know that the government's got its national industrial strategy that should have a focus on cities, and similarly, cities in their local growth plans should look to build a kind of a strong business base, focusing on knowledge jobs, but also a diverse range of businesses. So it's not overly concentrated in one industry. And that applies to places even with not much in their local economy today. I mean, a good example, that one we highlight in the report, is Barnsley, that it built off what it had, local economic strength, such as being in a logistics hub, but actually using that as a leaping off point to build into other industries such as tech, and not sort of resting on its laurels or doubling down on that industry, which is actually quite exposed to automation. So it's having that focus at the base of things, then also making sure that your local residents are plugged in to that economy, make sure they've got the right skills. A lot of that comes from central funding, but also allowing local places to target, skill shortages, pockets of deprivation, people without skills, and that making a real difference. The single most influential thing you can do to sort of raise someone's standard of living is get them into the labour market if they are not already there. I think one I didn't really touch on, but is important, particularly for bigger places. So let's say Birmingham, Leicester, Nottingham in the Midlands is can people physically get to your centres of employment? That means good transport linking people from where they live to where they work. And part of this, particularly in Birmingham, as one of the mayoral strategic authorities, is further transport devolution in these places to allow places to integrate their transport networks, let people take longer and faster journeys, and basically deepen that labor market, let people access more opportunities. But that again, going back to the first point, that doesn't come without having those opportunities there in the first place, and it's having that base of productive businesses particularly in your city centres for people to access. I think Birmingham's a really good example there, where I think on KIBS jobs it underperforms across the whole city. But if you take the city centre specifically, actually the composition of jobs there uh, in terms of KIBS is almost at the level of London. So I think it's about 75% of the way there to London. So in terms of composition, it looks quite productive and innovative. It's just that that city centre is too small, and it's too small to spread its prosperity far and wide across the city. Now, part of that is focusing on the business base, but also it's plugging that in wider in a kind of integrated, efficient transport network, which things like taking public control over buses and getting further rail devolution, integrated ticketing and timetables can all help with that. Finally, as I mentioned, it's making sure that you're not constraining your local economies. Now, that entails a few things, such as we know that the national planning system is a big restriction on building housing. It's picking up the pace of planning reform at the national level. There's also things like local government reorganisation, which will hopefully stop constraining cities that have underbounded political boundaries. It's making sure that there's an alignment between the political geography and the economic geography, so places can respond to business demand for office space or housing demand if their economy is picking up pace. So those are the main conclusions. There's a lot more detail in our Outlook report with you can look at all the charts with a lot of Midland cities in there. A few other things I'll point out before I get on to questions. Part of our report is looking at economic indicators across urban Britain. That's chapter 3 in our report. I think we do something like 17 indicators, all different areas: skills, employment, productivity. You can see where your city ranks relative to others. We do top 10, bottom 10s, and we do some lovely visualizations like this one, which is looking at the distribution of income deprivation within places. And I've highlighted a few cities in the Midlands there. You see kind of Birmingham with high concentrations of high income deprivation, and then more spread out places such as Nottingham, and actually Northampton does relatively well on that. But lots more cool visualizations and data in that for you to look at. And if that isn't enough, we've got more data, and this one is interactive. So we've got a data tool on our website. You can pick any indicator you want. You can pull out any years you want. You can look at it on a map. You can compare it to other places. You can download the data yourself. You've got free reign to see how Coventry does on productivity and how that relates to other places across the country. So I'd encourage all you to check those things out. If you've got more specific questions, read the report. We've got a lot of follow-up blogs looking at more details in the report there. So that's it in terms of me talking at you. I'll stop sharing and have a look at the chat to see what questions have popped up. So the first question there is Midland cities, mostly at the bottom half of the categories. They've stagnated. How reliable is the report as a guide for policy making? Reporting measures which are determined by long-term trends, but does it pinpoint actionable factors? Investment and innovation are examples where it appears not. So yeah, I mean, part of the reasoning with the report is I mean, it frames the focus of the government's mission on living standards. It's because we know that in aggregate there has been this national economic stagnation. I think the report actually uh, it's a bit of a bright spot in that context because it's saying, okay, at national level things are stagnated, but if you zoom in closer, actually there are some places that have bucked the trend, and they're not just your usual suspects. They're not. It's not just sort of London and Bristol and stuff, but it's places like Wakefield, Doncaster, Barnsley, Liverpool. In digging into those, and there are some case studies in the report, we think they have real actionable sort of lessons for other places in similar starting positions, and sort of bringing forward living standards in their place and helping their local economy. So again, we break it down in those three things, but there are more specific examples there. Liverpool has done lots of targeted skills interventions to bring its employment rate from the bottom of all cities in 2013 to much more in line with the average. Places like Brighton has capitalized on things like being a creative industries hub. Their productivity was well below average in 2013. Now it's in the top 10. And so, it's all these places, no matter their starting point, have made often sustained long-term policy interventions at the local level, sometimes using central government funding to help that. And, you're starting to see some of the changes there. So, I'd hope that some of the examples we pull out in the report there offer some food for thought in terms of policy making. Obviously, we have things that we are telling to the national government, things like, keep going on planning reform, keep going on transport devolution in big cities, and in your implementation in the industrial strategy, it's focusing on where that has most potential for success, which is in our city centres and our centres of the economy across the country. So I'd hope that it offers some sort of guide for policy making, or at least for local places. The question below that: see a reason why Midland cities tend to perform more poorly on these measures, or is that coincidental? It's a good question. I think, you know, in terms of the ingredients we break down there, it might just be the case that lots of these places don't tend to do so well on, having that productive business base, or at least growing it, relatively low on employment rates. Uh, I guess on the constraint side, that's less of an issue because it's more like getting the fundamentals of your economy down before you can start thinking about, okay, where are we restricted? I think a big part of it, I'm sure, is the underperformance of the larger cities in the regions. We know from previous research that, I mean, you just see it with cities surrounding London. They tend to do perform well, kind of in spite of their local economies, because they're more plugged into a big, successful regional economy in their place. And we know that places like Birmingham, Nottingham, Leicester have underperformed in terms of growing their city centres, their local economies uh, in general, but also relative to other big cities across the country. You see places like Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, which have in the past few years started to sort of tick up on an upward trajectory, and that sort of then helps places in their region and the surrounding areas. So I think beyond that, it is, I guess, slightly coincidental that lots of Midland cities tend to underperform. What I'd say is that they will not look particularly different to underperforming cities across the rest of the country, and every region has some of these underperforming cities. So, I don't think it's a specific Midlands problem. Mm, Places like Birmingham have good economic base, business base, and good employment access, growing transport links and connections. Why does it continue to perform so poorly? I mean, it's good in some sense, but it could be better. I think a big one in Birmingham is connectivity is much lower than what you'd expect for a city its size. It's actually, if you think its kind of effective population is only about 500,000 or something, as in that is the number of people who can get into the city centre within 30 minutes. And that is a lot lower than similarly sized cities, say in Europe. And that means smaller labour market, fewer people connected to opportunities, and a worse performing economy. I think its employment rate is good, but it's not great, and I think it's below average, and well below some of the heights that some places. So there are all explanations there. I think in Birmingham's case, it's that connectivity point, and it's making sure that there is connectivity to a base of productive businesses in its city centre, and it does have some of those. That's, in Birmingham city centre, and there's been changes there more recently. It's just that that city centre is not the size you'd expect it to be for a city its size. There is some prosperity there, and it goes to some people, but there is just not enough to go around the wider urban area. What do you think Midland's getting wrong compared to some other city regions in the north? It's a good question. I mean, so let's take Manchester's example, just being a bit more advanced on changes to transport policy there. They've kind of got the foundations for their integrated transport system there. Birmingham is on that path, but it's slightly behind. Where uh, like slightly behind where Manchester is there. I think you've seen a real focus, like a concerted long-term focus on Manchester city centre to attract in these sort of office-based, high-paying jobs. And I think a lot of that has been down to extensive development, providing the commercial space. I mean, you've seen sort of public sector help there too, such as moving sort of BBC studios up there as well. Um, I think that uh, you know you, you see all these changes. Manchester is still kind of on the initial path to growing its economy there. I'd be a bit skeptical of the latest productivity statistics saying that it's completely boomed. I think we've done some work in the past that suggests that might not be quite true. So I think it's probably good to highlight that it's not like they're on some sort of trajectory to the moon and places like Birmingham being left behind, but you are getting a sense of these things turning around. And I think it's that core of the economy, and so letting that grow, providing uh, the infrastructure for places to move in, and then just making sure residents can access that. Role of urban regeneration and development bringing about growth. How can the establishment MDC in Birmingham, for example, as well as the coming developments in HS2 and the sports quarter be leveraged to ensure citywide economic growth? I think, development also always plays a role, especially regeneration. I know there's lots of changes happening in Birmingham city centre. I think it's kind of, what does that urban fabric look like after that has happened? Is there enough high grade office space for the kinds of firms that you want to attract in there? Can you sort of plug into, given that these developments are happening, can sort of local authorities, can West Midlands tap into that, understand what other sectors would be interested in having those clusters, and then build that out? But it's not just focusing on what those developments are bringing. It's thinking a bit more broadly and saying what we know is that these high productivity firms they cluster. Across industries. It's not just one. So, it's kind of being alive to that, taking that as an opportunity to change the urban fabric and making sure that it's happening, but not that in itself is not enough. You need those productive businesses in there. Um, I I know there's a couple more questions. I realize I'm out of time. If you've got a burning desire to ask them, please just drop me an email and I can answer them there. But yeah, thank you for all your questions. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive, and I'll see you on the next one. Great. All right. Bye.